Advanced Client Documentation Review. In section 4.1, we will be analyzing financial documentation. This can be found on page 73 in your manual. When counseling, there are 2 points in time when you might determine if a client is mortgage ready. You might, after the first counseling session and after doing an analysis, find that the client is mortgage ready or close to it. On the other hand, you may need to wait until successful completion of the work plan to find that the client has the ability to qualify. Here are some steps you may go through with each client while determining readiness. You will look at their income, assets, job history, and other factors to assess their level of affordability. You will be determining and discussing the cost of home ownership. You will also compare loan products with the client, and you may offer assistance with filling out and submitting the loan application for pre-approval. You also may have some involvement in assisting the client in selecting a home. And always, you will review final documents with the client prior to closing. In addition to reviewing topics of interest after closing, it is important to review the same topics prior to. And here I am referring to the extra costs of home ownership compared to renting, such as home maintenance, taxes, insurance, and other items that a new homeowner may not have considered. On this slide, we review types of income and the ways workers get paid. You may be paid semi-monthly, meaning twice each month, or the pay may come biweekly, meaning every other week. There are workers who are paid once per month. Also, overtime will be calculated in some cases. When an employee is paid hourly, there is a more involved way to calculate income, just as there is when a person is self-employed. Some people may get interest income, dividend income, alimony, note income, trust income, income from retirement, or public assistance, including Section 8 funds. Also of special consideration is seasonal income, and then the income that comes in the form of cash and tips. We'll take a moment here on this slide to go through the steps in calculating seasonal income. In step 1, you gather the information you need for the calculation. In step 2, divide the 52 weeks in a year by 12 months, and you'll find that there are an average of 4.33 weeks in a month. In step 3, multiply 4.33 by the number of months worked to get the weeks worked. And finally, in step 4, multiply the weekly pay by the number of weeks worked to get the annual income, and divide by 12 to get the monthly income. Don't forget from your previous instruction about the grossing up of income. As you know, any taxable or non-taxable income is multiplied by 25% and added back to the income amount. But remember not to gross up for subsidy programs. Look on page 81 of your manual for a pay stub example. You will find the following on most any pay stub: the Social Security number, a name, the pay period, the pay date, the hours or units of pay, rate of your earnings, deductions, gross pay, taxes, and then finally net pay. Your areas of focus when reviewing the pay stubs are on the most 30 days of pay. Are they available for the lender's view? Are there any unexplained deductions? Is the gross pay equivalent to what the borrower filled out on their application or told you about? Does the name of the company match what you were given by the client? And also, does the Social Security number match? some lenders will be especially concerned about valid Social Security numbers. On page 81 of your manual, you will see an example of a W-2 form. You are most likely familiar with this form, where you find the employer's name and address, Social Security number of the client or the worker, the employee name and address, and then in Section 1, all the wages, tips, and any other compensation. Areas to focus on with the W-2 are, again, whether the Social Security number matches all other documents, and do the wages that are reported on the pay stub match what has been filled out on the application. Do the names and address of the client match for both client and the company. When you're considering revolving debt, points to consider, things to keep in mind are that you use the minimum payment when counting the debt and not the actual amount the consumer may be paying. Many consumers pay more than necessary, but you need to use the minimum payment. The client cannot pay off revolving debt to qualify for a loan in most cases. Keep in mind that most lenders advise they just continue as they are when they've already qualified under certain debts. And also keep in mind that payments for 30-day accounts will not be considered, since these accounts are required to be paid off each month. For installment debt, points to consider, or types of installment debt you're looking at. You might be looking at car payments, which are installment debt, as well as student loans, mortgages. Alimony and child support is also considered an installment debt, or any other debt that has a fixed payment plan and a fixed repayment schedule. And here are more points to consider related to installment debt. Deferred student loans are normally going to be counted against the client who is looking at conventional loans. Now, FHA may not count deferred student debt if the client can show on a letter or on a credit report that there is at least a 12-month deferral. But always use the monthly payment for the student loan as seen on the credit report or on the account. And if the client has a debt that will be paid off in 10 months or less, do not assume that you don't have to count it. Some lenders require that you do count it, and some will not. Now go to your manual on page 85. Read the case study there for practice in computing ratios. You will have learned this in pre-purchase 1, but as you know, extra practice never hurts. Calculate the income on page 85 and 86, and then calculate the maximum PPII, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, using the income and liabilities. Pause the webinar now and work on this exercise, and then resume the webinar to check your answers. So looking at the box on page 85, let's fill in the blanks. Under the borrower, we have an income of $4,133.33 as the monthly income. For the co-borrower, we have $3,385.42. There is 0 overtime and 0 rental income. Their total income is $7,518.75. Under the ratios, we have, for the front-end ratio, $2,105.25, and under the back-end ratio, $2,706.75. I'm going to pause for a second. Just want to make sure you have that blank page in front of you so you can fill it in, since I'm going rather quickly. Next, under the monthly debts, you would have listed a car with a payment of $400 and a balance of $8,000, a second car with a payment of $278, balance of $6,500, credit cards with payments of $120 and $35 for a total of $155 and a balance of $10,000, and a student loan for $75 with a balance of $10,000. The total monthly debt equals $908. When figuring up the maximum principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, take 36%, which is the back-end ratio, and then subtract the debt. In other words, $2,706.75, subtract the debt of $908, and that equals $1,798.75. The front-end ratio was $2,105.25, so you must use the lower of the two. Always choose the lower of the two. So in this situation, their maximum PPII is $1,798.78. In determining the loan amount, first we'll estimate that the principal and interest part of the payment is 80% and the taxes and insurance are 20%. So 20% of $1,798.75 gets you a figure of $359.75 for taxes and insurance. Subtract that from the PPII to get $1,439. To continue determining the maximum loan advance, go to the factor table in your manual on page 90. Find the 6% interest rate for a 30-year term to get your factor of 6. Divide your PPII of $1,439 by 6, which equals 239.833. Multiply that figure by 1,000 to get your maximum loan amount of $239,833. Wasn't that fun? Now, a counseling tip regarding ratios. Some grant programs have their own ratios, and you'll find that they're often more conservative than your local lender's ratios. Another thing to think about is that lenders in today's markets are generally more focused and concerned about the back-end ratio, which, as you've learned, is the total house payment plus all the monthly debt. Now let's finish up section 1 by running through a couple of slides that list different types of assets. On the first slide we have savings and checking accounts, gift funds, which can sometimes be counted for the purchase, sale of assets, other assets the homeowner may have, or proceeds from the sale of one house for the purchase of another. Collateralized loans, which means borrowing from one asset or another asset to purchase, but of course you have to, that payment has to be counted when you're doing the debt-to-income ratio. Employer guarantee plans, which is where an employer agrees to purchase an employee's existing home if the employee is relocating, or employee assistance plan, where the employer might pay the down payment or other closing costs to relocate a valuable employee. On the next slide, we have other assets to consider: savings bonds that may be cashed for the purchase, or using IRA, 401k, KEO account, or a SEP account. But of course, you must help the client weigh the costs and penalties of cashing out investment accounts against the benefit. Often the cost is too high for the benefit. The client might also use stocks and bonds, any cash on hand, rent credit, sweat equity, where the buyer does some construction work in exchange for actual cash, maybe commission from the sale If the buyer or an immediate relative is the agent, they might also contribute their commission to be used for the purchase. There are also disaster relief grants and loans and small business administration loans that are sometimes counted as assets. But if these loans are to be secured by the property, typically they must subordinate to the first mortgage lender. In section 4.2, starting on page 94 of your manual, we'll be discussing credit reports. And we'll skim through some of it since a lot of it was covered in pre-purchase 1. For example, you're already familiar with the 3 credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. And you are most likely also familiar with the types of credit reports. The consumer can pull their own credit report, and as you know, they are allowed to and guaranteed 1 free credit report every year. And the best place to get that, as you know, is from the annualcreditreport.com. The counseling agency can also pull an in-file credit report, and this can be a hard pull, which can affect a credit report, or a soft pull, which does not. Also, the lender will pull a tri-merge or residential mortgage credit report, which contains information from all 3 major bureaus. We'll walk quickly through this slide containing the components of a credit report, as you are already familiar with these components, including the applicant information, any alerts on the credit file, public information such as judgments and liens and bankruptcies. No, judgments and liens, anything that requires a court hearing. I think I got messed up. Alerts, public records, inquiries, address information, employment information, and there may be other miscellaneous things on there, credit score information, credit information, and creditor information. Take some time now to pause the recording and view the sample report on page 98 in your manual. And now that you've had time to review the sample report, let's look at some of the coding. As you reviewed the report, you would have noticed that A stands for the authorized user and B for the borrower. You may have seen also that C is for the co-borrower. I is for installment debt like car loans and mortgages. The letter J indicates a joint account. The letter M, a mortgage account. When you see the letter O, that indicates an open account. R, a revolving account. The letter T means the account is terminated. And finally, the letter U stands for undesignated account. On the next slide, we look at number codes. A designation of 0 means the account is too new, hasn't been used yet, or it's too new to rate. A 1 shows an account in good standing, in other words, current. A 2 shows that the account is at least 30 days late, and then the higher the number, the later we get. 3 is 60 days late. 4, 90 days late, up to 119. And then once you hit 120 days or more past due, you hit the number 5. At this point, if bankruptcy isn't filed on an unsecured debt, it will be placed for collection, and we'll see that at the end for number 9. But secured and unsecured debt can be legally managed through bankruptcy using a Chapter 7 or a Chapter 13 plan. Those accounts will be assigned a number 7. Repossession of a vehicle or foreclosure on a house or other secured debt results in a number 8. And there's our collection debt at number 9. Here's a pie chart to help you remember or see visually the weight that different components have on a credit score calculation. Note that the heaviest weight, or the component having the most impact on the credit score, is one's payment history at 35%. The next most important component is the amount owed. You see that there at 30%. And then the length of the credit history, which is weighted at 15%. And having equal but the least impact are the other two, the new credit and the types of credit in use. Sometimes I use the word plant to remember these 5 categories. P for payment history, L for length of payment history, but remembering that the payment history is the heaviest, and then A, the amounts owed, is next. And then we already talked about the L, and then N in the word plant for new credit, and T for types. Sometimes that just, when I'm trying to think of the parts, that helps me remember that. Contrary to what was formerly believed, it is best not to close credit card accounts when trying to that was my fault. Paying the bills on time and getting current and staying current, of course. Satisfying any collection counts that are out there. If it's not too old, some of the older ones are better left alone. Sticking to a budget, of course, once you've designed a budget. That's the first step, is getting it on paper, but then sticking to it is probably the harder thing. Keeping your balances low and paid off if possible, and then paying down and paying off the debt rather than just moving it around and never reducing it. As mentioned before, it is usually best not to close unused accounts. Instead, use several trade lines that keep the balances low or paid off. Again, especially when working to qualify for a mortgage loan, do not create any new credit lines. Also, keep your searches to a 30-day period to keep from having too many inquiries. If they're done within a short period of time, several inquiries on the same type of credit should show up only as one inquiry. Open credit only as needed. Be responsible and don't try to outsmart the model. These are all tips for each of us and for us to pass on to our clientele. Look on page 105 in your manual for an example on how closing an account can lower one's credit score. There you'll see an example of the use of 3 credit cards, one with a limit of $1,000, a second card with a limit of $1,500, and a third card with a limit of $2,500. The total owed amount is $5,000, and the total limit is $5,000, and the amounts owed are $600, $750, and $250, totaling $1,600. That $1,600 is 32% of the $5,000 limit. Since it's optimal to owe only 30% of or less of one's total credit limit, the next section shows how the credit score would be improved by paying off card number 3 and lowering the amount to 27% of the limit. At this point, one might think it would be helpful to close the paid-off card. However, this action could lower the credit score. On page 105, you see that now if card 3 is closed, the amount owed jumps to 54% of the credit limit, which can do damage to the score. It is best to pay accounts down or pay them off monthly and then keep them revolving. Some lenders will close accounts after several months of non-use. So what does the credit score mean? This slide gives you some idea of how lenders view the credit score. 680 and above is considered A credit and acceptable by probably almost all lenders. Between 640 and 680 is also considered A credit, but they will do a closer review. A score between 620 and 640 may possibly be considered A credit, although you will have to have some compensating factors with the lower score. And below 620 means the potential buyer may be looking beyond conventional loans to FHA and other products. There's below 620. This slide gives you an idea of the national distribution of FICO scores in the U.S. for those who do hold credit scores. Noticeably, only 13% of those with credit scores score 800 or above, while the largest group at 33% falls between 650 and 750. The next largest group falls in the 750 to 800 category. Maybe you can find yourself on that chart. This slide illustrates some credit score flags. These are common to you, I'm sure. These accounts are those in collection status, bankruptcy status, those with liens and judgments showing up, charge-offs, garnishments, too many inquiries, a discrepancy that needs to be disputed, and compensating factors. Look in your manual for more details about red flags. So check out this chart to see how long items stay on the credit report. As you see, most items stay on the report for 7 years. A bankruptcy Chapter 7 is considered the more serious of the two, 7 and 13, and so it will stay on the credit report longer, 10 years after the discharge date. And then at the end there you see that they use the word forever for unpaid tax liens or other government liens, and it says the government never gives up. So that's a hard one to shake. Just a brief note here on the effects of short sales and deeds in lieu of foreclosure on your credit report, or on somebody else's credit report, hopefully. Well, anyway, this is found on page 110 in the manual. And a short sale is when the lender agrees to accept less than the amount owed against the home. The effect of a short sale is less damaging on the credit than that of a foreclosure, but it can result in a drop in your credit score of up to 100 points, 80 to 100 points. And then the waiting period before purchase of another home can be 2 to 3 years. A foreclosure or deed in lieu will result in a hit of 250 to 280 points on the credit score. And the waiting period for buying another home, again, may be at least 36 months, could be more, depending on the state. With deficiency judgments, they may be pursued in some states after cases of short sale or foreclosure. So always get familiar with your particular state laws and consult with an attorney to have the details. And of course, never act as an attorney. Refer your clients to a real estate attorney or a foreclosure attorney. Sometimes folks haven't been able to establish traditional credit, so on page 111 we go through some ways to establish non-traditional credit. These include using documents from the credit union or banks that don't report to the credit bureaus, copies of your utility bills, proof of rental payments, any proof on-time monthly insurance is paid, and child support paid, proof of that, along with school tuition, store credit, medical bill payments, and any other payments paid on time, like for your internet service, auto leases, and personal loans. This last slide in section 4.2 is to remind you of ways to help your clients with budgeting and savings. You're going to encourage your clients to use PowerPay, to try perhaps the envelope method, to use debit cards responsibly, to always pay themselves first, and to get their savings goals set and put into writing. Moving on to section 4.3, calculating income for a self-employed client, starting on page 114. At a minimum, the documentation needed includes 2 years of tax returns, year-to-date profit and loss statements, and a year-to-date balance sheet. Sometimes that's not necessary if you're in the first quarter of the year. Here we'll take a brief look at some of the lines on the 1040 on page 114 of your manual. Line 7 states the wages, salaries, and tips and requires the W-2 form. Line 8 is the client's taxable interest income from investments and can be used as income as long as the money generating that interest isn't being used to buy the new house. Same way with line 8B, which is the non-taxable interest income. That non-taxable interest income may be grossed up, should be grossed up, or will be grossed up by the lender anyway, so as a counselor you also do that. Line 11 is alimony and may be used as income depending on the time remaining on the agreement. Line 12 addresses business income and loss from Schedule C, which is actually what you do use to derive the client's income. You will not use line 12 as the income figure because certain deductions can be added back in. Lines 16 through 18 address miscellaneous income that may or may not be relevant. Line 20A regards Social Security benefits, and of course those also are grossed up. Line 22 is the borrower's taxable income, but again, that's the total, but this number is not used when you're working with self-employed clients. That's what this section is about. Lines 23 through 33 are deductions from taxable income, which again are not used for self-employed clients. What you do use is Schedule C, and you start by looking at the gross income, but you don't use the gross income because you add in expenses. That's part 2. You add some of the expenses back in. So you will take these steps working through the example on page 118. You use the total amount from year 1 in line 31. We don't have a slide on this. You just need to look in the manual. So you have the total amount from year 1 on line 31. Then you add lines 12 and 13 in to get your total usable income. So in the example in the manual, the total amount from year 1 is $48,000, and then the total amount in year 2 is $65,000, and that's with lines 12 and 13 added back in. So once you add in everything, you get a grand total of $113,000, and when that figure is divided by 24, that's how you come up with the monthly income that can be used to pre-qualify this client. And that figure in this example is $4,708. Okay, the last section, section 4.4, is using subsidies to maximize buying power. This starts on page 118 of your manual. You'll find that many communities have homes, the prices in many communities have exceeded affordability for many lower and moderate income members of our community. we've seen prices go up and wages have not. So subsidies that provide down payment and closing cost assistance, among other types of assistance, may provide critical support to our clients. As a counselor, you need to learn about the various programs offered in your city and state and find out about their restrictions and guidelines. The types of assistance besides closing costs and down payment assistance, there are also rehabilitation assistance out there if that rehab is on the home you're purchasing. There are some subsidies for community land trusts and some programs that allow for sweat equity that we talked about before. These subsidies come through federal, state, and local sources, often are funneled through nonprofits, but there also can be offered through lenders who are offering affordable loan products. As a counseling agency, we have the task of researching the product availability and becoming familiar with the subsidy guidelines and checking out the client situation to make sure they meet the income limits. This can be confusing, and so it's the counselor's job to help explain these subsidies to the potential homeowner. Subsidies may sometimes possibly be layered. In this case, most require separate applications with all the proofs and supporting documentation. And clients need to be aware, or counselors rather, need to be aware of the limitations on purchase price sometimes, the different areas they're allowed to purchase in, and any long-term restrictions for the property they're choosing, such as the use of the property, the zoning, and what's required for maintenance. So we're going to follow through on these next 3 slides for some counseling steps and other considerations while you're working in the subsidy application process. First, build your matrix of local options and find out about the guidelines and restrictions. Next, identify which funds are available. Then, after calculating the client's maximum mortgage amount, add in your subsidy layers. This increases the overall purchase price for your client. Next, assist the client in completing applications and in searching for the appropriate lenders who are agree to approve loans that have subsidies. And you want to be aware that you won't be closing until after all contracts and inspections are completed. And be aware, there's a little star there by the inspections, because certain subsidy programs may require a different level of inspection. Many steps, so as we're going through all these steps, it takes extra work. Finding the subsidies and layering them may require more time spent with the counselor, more time on the counselor's part. So both the counselor and the client need to be prepared to spend more time. And the counselor has to stay involved with all the different parties and coordinate everything and make sure all documents are submitted and complete. And then before closing, make sure to review the special note restrictions and deed restrictions related to the particular subsidies you might be using with your client. In selecting the appropriate subsidy, the counselor needs to be aware of many things, including the purpose of the subsidy, whether it's for down payment, closing costs, rehab, repairs, or other needs. Also, the type of loan and whether it will be held as a second or third lien on the property and whether it's forgivable or not. Another consideration is the amount of the loan, as some subsidies have, or the amount of the subsidy rather, as some of them have matched savings investments, meaning that the homeowner must contribute some of their own money. The counselor needs to check on repayment terms and whether there are any first mortgage financing restrictions, and also check on the eligibility requirements of the subsidy participants. As you've learned about ratios, you have to also check on the requirements certain subsidy funds require in terms of ratios and also in terms of inspections. Also, only certain property types may be permitted for purchase. Some types, such as maybe mobile homes or other homes, may be not allowed. Check to see that home buyer education, whether that's required by an agency. That's often the case. And make sure you understand the application policy and procedures. The benefits of subsidies are obvious. It can make the home more affordable for the client. Typically, owning provides more stability, financial and otherwise, for the client. Can create wealth in the family and the ability to leave a home to heirs. And it's a great benefit to our aspiring homeowners to have access to counseling and resources both before the purchase and after the purchase. Here's a slide that shows an example of one particular subsidy. You can see here that the maximum grant available per unit on this particular example is $8,000. And this is a 5-year grant. That's 60 months. And every month, 1/60th of that grant is forgiven, so that by the end of the 5 years, it's totally forgiven. And in this example, the grant can be used for down payment, closing costs, rehab, and even reimbursing the homeowner for counseling costs. You see there the eligible borrowers are 80% or less of the AMI. Eligible properties include 1- and 2-family dwelling units. This was a particular subsidy in Illinois, so this was covering urban and rural areas. We have the type of amortization in the term. So this is a fixed rate, and ARMs are also allowed under certain restrictions. And you have to check on the participating lenders and make sure it's for purchase or purchase with construction or purchase with rehab. Then we have the types of first mortgages permitted, conventional, FHA, and so forth, and the borrower's minimum required cash contribution, in this case $1,000. So if you haven't already done so, on page 123 there is an activity, so check out that activity. And with this exercise, we have completed Unit 4. Thank you.